Father built Hargrove Associates from a spare bedroom and a borrowed copy machine. That's the story he told every Thanksgiving, every graduation dinner, every time a new client walked through the front door of the firm's downtown Chicago office. He told it so many times that by the time I was 12, I could recite it word for word, including the part where he paused for effect before saying, "And that's when I knew. The law was in our blood." He meant mine, too. He always meant mine. My name is Natalie. I'm the only daughter of Warren Hargrove, senior partner and founder of one of Chicago's most respected mid-size litigation firms. My mother, Sandra, was a contracts attorney who met my father during their second year at Northwestern Law. My older brother, Curtis, passed the bar on his first attempt and joined the firm at 26. My aunt, my father's sister, handled estate planning out of the firm's North Shore satellite office. The Hargroves didn't just practice law. We were law, at least according to every framed article and award plaque that covered the walls of my childhood home. I knew from the time I was about 16 that I didn't want any part of it. Not because I hated the law. I actually found it fascinating in the abstract, the logic of it, the way a well-constructed argument could shift the entire weight of a situation. What I couldn't stand was the culture of it. The billable hours that swallowed my father whole every December. The way my mother would come home from depositions with that tight, exhausted look around her eyes and pour herself a glass of wine before she'd even taken off her coat. The constant measuring. Grades, rankings, clerkship placements, firm prestige, like your entire worth as a human being could be calculated on a spreadsheet. I wanted to build things, not arguments, actual things, companies, systems, something you could point to and say, I made that exist. When I told my father junior year of high school that I was thinking about business school instead of pre-law, he laughed. Not a mean laugh. More like the kind of laugh you give a child who says they want to be an astronaut. Patient. Slightly condescending. You'll change your mind, he said. I didn't. I went to the University of Michigan for undergrad, majored in finance, minored in economics. I was good at it. Genuinely good, not just grinding hard good. My professors told me I had a rare instinct for capital structure, for seeing where value was buried inside a business before anyone else saw it. I applied to 3 MBA programs my senior year. Got into all 3. Chose Wharton. My father's reaction when I told him, "You're really going through with this." Not a question. A verdict. My mother tried to soften it. She said he was proud of me, that he just worried about my future, that law offered security, but I'd watched enough of their life to know what that security actually cost. I smiled, thanked her, and went back to Philadelphia. The years at Wharton were some of the hardest and best of my life. I thrived in the finance concentration, spent 2 summers at a private equity firm in New York, and by graduation had a full-time offer from that same firm, Alderton Capital, at a salary that would have made my father's eyebrows rise if he'd known. I didn't tell him. By that point, we spoke maybe 4 times a year. Holidays, birthdays, the occasional check-in that felt more like a performance review than a conversation. My brother and I were closer, but even Curtis had absorbed so much of my father's worldview that talking to him sometimes felt like talking to a slightly younger version of the same argument. He kept gently suggesting I might reconsider, that there was still a place for me at the firm, that Dad wouldn't say it outright, but he missed me. I told Curtis I was fine. I was more than fine. At Alderton, I specialized in distressed asset acquisitions, identifying companies that were undervalued, usually because of structural problems that weren't visible from the outside, and either fixing them or facilitating their sale to buyers who could. I was good at seeing the thing beneath the thing. I learned that from my father actually, even if he'd never admit it. He always said the best litigators find the argument the other side doesn't know they're making. I just applied that to balance sheets instead of depositions. I made partner track at 31. By 33, I was leading my own deals. And then my father called me about the firm. It was a Tuesday in March. I remember because I was on my way into a meeting and almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me pick up. Natalie. His voice had a different quality to it, thinner somehow. Dad, everything okay? There was a pause. My father did not pause. He filled silence like it was a professional obligation. Your mother and I have been talking, he said, about the firm's future. I stepped out of the hallway and found an empty conference room. I sat down. What came out over the next 20 minutes was this. Hargrove Associates was struggling. Had been for about 3 years, though my father described it in language so carefully managed that it took me a while to understand the actual severity. 2 major clients had left for larger national firms. A key partner, the one who handled most of their corporate litigation, had retired and they hadn't replaced him well. The North Shore office was bleeding money. They'd taken on a line of credit to cover operating costs 18 months ago, and the interest was compounding in ways that were starting to feel serious. My father needed capital. He needed a strategic partner, or a buyer, or something in between that he hadn't fully defined yet. He'd been talking to a few people. But he was calling me, he said, because family was family. Because maybe it was time to bring me into this in some way. You work in finance, he said. You know people. I noticed he didn't say you're good at this. He said you know people. Like I was a useful contact rather than a professional who'd spent a decade building exactly the expertise he now needed. What kind of arrangement are you thinking? I asked. Something where we maintain control, he said immediately. This is still our firm. It has our name on it. Any partner who comes in needs to understand that. We're not looking to be absorbed or managed. We're looking for support. Right, I said. I thought maybe you could introduce me to someone at your firm. Or point me toward other options. And there it was. He didn't want me. He wanted my Rolodex. I told him I'd look into it. I got off the phone, sat in that empty conference room for a few minutes, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. That specific mix of hurt and tired that my father had always been able to produce in me with almost surgical efficiency. The hurt because he still couldn't bring himself to just say, I need your help, Natalie. The tired because I'd spent so long waiting for that moment, and somehow it still managed to disappoint me. Then I pulled up the firm's public records, and I started actually looking. What I found was more interesting than my father had let on. Hargrove Associates had real problems, yes, but underneath those problems was something genuinely valuable. 40 years of client relationships in a specific niche of Illinois commercial litigation, a reputation that still carried weight in certain courtrooms, real estate assets attached to the main office that were worth considerably more than they appeared on the books, and a collection of small to mid-sized business clients who were loyal but underserved. Clients who needed not just litigation support but integrated legal and financial advisory services that a boutique firm had never been positioned to offer them. I'd seen this pattern before, a lot of times actually. A business that was financially distressed, not because the core value was gone, but because the structure around it had calcified. The people running it were too close to it, too proud of what it had been, to see clearly what it could become. I spent 2 weeks running numbers before I made a single call. Then I called my own attorney and told her I wanted to explore an acquisition. She was quiet for a moment. Of your father's firm? Yes. Natalie. I know. Does he know you're doing this? No. And I needed to stay that way for a while. I want to come in as a buyer, not as a daughter. If he knows it's me, he'll either refuse on principle or he'll try to restructure the whole thing into something I can't work with. She was quiet again. Then, you've thought this through? I've thought this through. I set up a holding company, Meridian Advisory Group, and had my attorney begin quiet preliminary conversations with the firm's existing creditors and with a contact who did business with Hargrove on the real estate side. Within 6 weeks, I had a comprehensive picture of the firm's liabilities and a clear acquisition thesis. I brought in one outside investor, a woman I'd worked with at Alderton named Patricia, who understood the vision and had no emotional stake in the outcome. The offer we put together was serious, fair, and structured specifically to address the things my father had told me he needed: capital infusion, restructuring support, and a path that preserved the firm's identity. The Hargrove name would stay. The Hargrove name would stay. The senior partners would retain meaningful equity. But Meridian would hold controlling interest and guide the strategic direction going forward. We submitted the offer through the firm's outside counsel, requested a formal meeting to present it. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in April at the firm's downtown office. I dressed carefully that morning. Navy blazer, white blouse, the kind of outfit that reads as serious but not aggressive. I'd been in dozens of negotiations by that point. I knew how to calibrate a room. What I didn't account for was seeing my father's face when I walked in. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. My father was standing near the head of the table with my brother and two of the firm's senior partners, a man named Douglas who'd been with the firm for 20 years, and a younger woman named April who handled most of their appellate work. There were also two outside attorneys representing the firm's interests in the acquisition process. My father's expression when he saw me did something I hadn't seen it do since I was a child. It broke apart a little, just for a second. Then it reassembled. Natalie. His voice was perfectly even. "What is you doing here?" "I'm representing Meridian Advisory Group," I said. I set my portfolio on the table. "I'm the principal buyer." The silence in the room was the kind that has texture. I could feel Douglas looking between my father and me. My brother had gone very still in the way he went. Still when he was trying to compute something that didn't fit his model. "I don't understand," my father said. "I know you don't. I'd like to explain it if you'll let me." He sat down. I sat across from him. I opened the portfolio and walked the room through the acquisition structure the same way I would have walked any client through it. Clearly, methodically, with every number accounted for. The capital infusion, the debt restructuring, the operational changes I was proposing, the projected path to profitability over 18 months. I answered Douglas's questions directly. I responded to April's concerns about the appellate practice with specifics I prepared for exactly that conversation. My father said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes. He just watched me. When I finished, he looked at the summary sheet in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked up. "You did this without telling me?" "Yes." "Why?" I had prepared for this question. I had a professional answer ready, a clean explanation about market dynamics and the importance of an arm's-length evaluation. I looked at my father across that conference table and gave him the real one instead, because if I'd told you it was me, you would have told me I didn't understand the law business, or that I was being sentimental, or that you needed someone with the right background for this. I paused. You would have found a reason to say no before you'd seen the work? So I needed you to see the work first. My brother made a small sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. My father looked at me for a long time. "That's not fair," he said finally. "Maybe not," I said. "But it's true, isn't it?" He didn't answer that. He picked up the summary sheet again. We didn't close the deal that day. These things don't close in a day. There were weeks of due diligence, rounds of negotiation, moments where I wasn't sure it would come together. Not because the numbers didn't work, but because the emotional weight of what we were doing kept bleeding into the business conversations in ways that had to be carefully managed. My brother called me 3 days after that first meeting. "He's not sleeping," Curtis said. "I know this is hard for him. He keeps saying you went behind his back." "I know he does. Did you have to do it this way?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the phone call in March. The way my father had said, "You know people," instead of "I need you." I thought about 15 years of holidays where I'd sat at a table full of attorneys and defended my choices to people who saw my career as a detour from a path I was supposed to be on. "Curtis," I said, "did he ever even once come to one of my presentations? Ask about a deal I was working on? Ask me anything about my work that wasn't just checking in to see if I'd changed my mind about coming to the firm?" A long silence. "No," my brother said quietly. "Then yes," I said. I had to do it this way, because any other way, he never would have actually looked. The closing happened on a Thursday in late June. There were a lot of attorneys in the room. Patricia flew in from New York. My mother attended, which I hadn't expected. She sat near the back of the conference room in a charcoal blazer. And when I came in, she stood up and hugged me, which also I hadn't expected. "I always knew you were extraordinary," she said quietly into my shoulder. I should have said it more. I had to take a breath before I could respond. My father signed the documents. He didn't say much during the signing itself. Afterward, when the room had thinned out and it was mostly just family and a few of our attorneys, he came and stood next to me by the windows. Chicago was doing that thing it does in late June where the sky over the lake is almost impossibly blue. We stood there for a while not saying anything. "The thesis is sound," he said finally. This was, coming from Warren Hargrove, about as close to "you were right" as I was ever going to get. "I think so," I said. "The appellate practice expansion, I wouldn't have thought of it. You were too close to the existing structure to see the gap." He nodded slowly. "Then, I should have asked you for help. When I called in March, I should have just asked." I looked at him. He was looking out at the lake, not at me, but his jaw had that particular tightness that I'd only seen in him maybe twice in my life. Once when his own father died, and once when my mother had been sick. It was the look he got when something was costing him. "Yeah," I said, "you should have." "I didn't think you'd." He stopped, started again. "I didn't know how to ask someone who wasn't," another stop. "Wasn't a lawyer," I offered. He turned and looked at me then. Something in his face that I didn't have a name for. Older than pride, older than stubbornness. Something that had been there a long time. "Wasn't someone I trained," he said. I didn't know how to need help from someone I hadn't trained. I let that sit. "Well," I said finally, "now you know how." He reached out and put his hand on my shoulder. Briefly, the way he always showed affection, like the gesture was something he borrowed and had to give back quickly. But it was there. "The Wharton MBA," he said. "Did you know then that you'd end up here?" "No," I said honestly. "I knew I'd end up somewhere. I didn't know it would circle back." He nodded. "Your grandfather would have liked this," he said. "He always said the best deal is the one where everybody walks away with something." "What do you walk away with?" I asked. He considered it. "The firm survives. That matters to me." "Good," I said, "because it should." The first 6 months under the new structure were hard in the way that real change is always hard. There were staff who didn't like the new reporting lines. There were partners who pushed back on the strategic shifts I was implementing. My father had moments where he second-guessed the deal. I could tell when I'd get a call from Curtis saying Dad's been in his office all day, and I'd fly in from New York and sit down with him and go through the numbers again until the numbers did what they always do for people who understand them, which is tell the truth. But the appellate practice expansion worked. The client advisory services worked. A significant mid-size manufacturing company that had been a Hargrove client for 20 years expanded their engagement dramatically when we added the financial advisory component. By the end of the first full year under Meridian, the firm had returned to profitability. By the end of the second year, we'd paid off the entire original line of credit and opened a second expansion office. My father came to a deal presentation I gave to a new prospective client, a real estate development group that was considering retaining the firm for a complex transaction. He sat in the back. I saw him come in, but I didn't break my stride. I finished the presentation, answered every question, closed the meeting. Afterward, he came up while I was gathering my materials. "Good room read," he said. The moment they pushed back on the fee structure, you shifted the framing before they'd finished the sentence. I learned to listen for the argument underneath the argument, I said. "Someone told me that was what the best litigators do." He looked at me. Then he smiled, fully, without qualification, the kind of smile I'd spent most of my life trying to earn from him. "Yeah," he said. "They do. People ask me sometimes whether I wish I'd done it differently, whether I could have just walked in the front door and said, 'Dad, I want to help. Let me show you what I can do.' Maybe. I've thought about it. But I know my father, and I know myself, and I know that if I'd come through that door as his daughter, I would never have been able to show him anything. He would have been too busy being my father to see what I'd actually become." Sometimes you have to show someone the work before you can show them who you are. That's the thing about spending your whole life building your own version of something. At some point, if you've built it right, it speaks for itself. And sometimes the people who needed the most convincing become the ones who are most convinced. My father still comes into the office 3 days a week. He's transitioned out of litigation into a senior advisory role, which suits him better than either of us expected. Last month, he called me, unprompted, not a holiday, not a crisis, just to tell me about an interesting tax issue one of the clients had raised and to ask what I thought. I gave him my analysis. He told me I'd missed something. I told him he was wrong. We argued for 45 minutes and ended the call laughing. It was the best conversation we'd had in 20 years. I still don't want to be a lawyer. I was right about that at 16, and I'm right about it now. But I understand something I didn't understand then, that the things we build alongside the people who didn't believe in us, when we finally build them, mean something different than the things we build alone. Not better or worse, just different. Like there's more weight to them somehow, more truth. I think about that sometimes when I'm walking into the downtown Chicago office and I see the Hargrove Associates sign above the door. Still there, still the same font, now with a small Meridian logo in the corner that most people wouldn't even notice. My grandfather was right. The best deal is the one where everybody walks away with something. I just had to make sure this time that I was at the table. I've had a lot of time to think about what my father actually taught me. Not in the way he intended, but in the way that things really get passed down between people. Not through instruction. Through watching. I watched Warren Hargrove build something real. 40 years of showing up, of believing that the work mattered, of putting his name on the door and meaning it. That part I understood completely. What I couldn't inherit was the part that came with it. The certainty that his way was the only way something could be built. That's not a character flaw. It's what happens when you succeed at something hard. You start to believe the path you took is the path. What I learned, slowly and honestly, is that there's a cost to that belief when it turns outward, when it starts deciding for other people what they're capable of before they've had the chance to show you. My father didn't think of himself as someone who was holding me back. I genuinely believe that. He thought he was protecting the firm. Protecting a legacy, being realistic, but the effect on me, on the 22-year-old version of me sitting across from him explaining why I wanted to go to Wharton instead of law school, was that I learned I would have to build my credibility somewhere he couldn't see it, somewhere his judgment couldn't reach it, before it would be real enough for him to take seriously. That's a hard thing to sit with. Not bitter, just true. And here's what I know about that kind of situation. The actions you take in response to being underestimated become the whole story eventually. I could have spent those years resenting him. I could have stayed angry at the distance between us and let that distance define what I built. Instead, I put my head down and I learned things. I got genuinely good at something. Not to prove a point, that motivation burns out too fast, but because the work itself turned out to be worth doing. That's the part nobody tells you. The discipline you build when no one's watching doesn't just make you successful. It makes you someone you can actually trust. And that trust in yourself is the thing that held steady in that conference room. When my father looked across the table at me, and I had to be both his daughter and someone he had to take seriously as a professional. I could only do that because I knew in the clearest possible way what I had actually built. Curtis called me a few weeks after the closing. He said our father had been telling the story to clients, the acquisition, the way it had come together. The daughter he hadn't fully known he had. He sounds proud, Curtis said. Actually proud, not just polite proud. I didn't cry about that, but I held on to it for a minute before I said anything back. I think what I want anyone to take from this is something simple. The intelligence you develop, the integrity you maintain when it costs you something, and the persistence you practice in private, those 3 things compound over time the same way interest compounds in a good investment. You don't always see it happening, but one day you walk into a room and the work you've done quietly for years speaks before you have to say a single word. My grandfather said the best deal is one where everybody walks away with something. I think the best life might work the same way. Not perfectly, not without pain, but with enough honesty on all sides that, eventually, the people who matter most to you finally see you clearly. That's what I walked away with. And I think, in the end, so did my father.